right. Well, the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is appearing before the COVID-19 inquiry and said he takes full responsibility for the decisions made during the pandemic. He also apologised for the pain and loss suffered by so many families up and down the country.
But there have been some moments of contention as well, and sitting through all of it, so that you don't have to, has been GB News presenter Pip Tomson. She's outside the COVID inquiry in London for us now. And Pip, what were the biggest flashpoints that we've seen so far today?
One of the biggest flashpoints, Tom, actually came just before the inquiry broke for lunch, just before 1 o'clock, when the former Prime Minister actually appeared to fight back tears. He became emotional when he was talking about the ongoing debate between going into lockdown versus the risks of behavioural fatigue. Boris Johnson has said he was anxious about locking down because of the lack of a vaccination programme. He said it was an anxiety, a problem that was very prevalent during those early days of the pandemic, February, March 2020. And then his voice appeared to break, and he said we have to be realistic about 2020, the whole year, that whole tragic year. He then paused for a moment to compose himself. And at the very beginning of the inquiry, where the room was packed full with families of the bereaved, they are outside now giving their reaction to what they've heard of Boris Johnson's 3 hours of evidence. At the beginning of the inquiry, he did make this apology. Have a listen.
I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families. And grateful though I am to the hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers and many other public servants and people in all walks of life who helped to protect our country throughout a dreadful pandemic, I do hope that this inquiry will help to get the answers to the very difficult questions that those victims and those families are rightly asking.
And it was around the time of that apology that Baroness Hallett, who's chairing the inquiry, she had to step in because a number of people had to be ejected from the room for standing up, holding up posters, and then refusing to sit down again. What has become very clear during the course of Boris Johnson's evidence is that there was a complete disbelief, if you like, about the scale of this pandemic. And he said, Boris Johnson, that his mindset, like the overwhelming majority of ministers and officials in Whitehall between January and mid-February 2020, was simply not as alarmed as it should have been. And he said the scientific community within Whitehall wasn't telling us that this was something that was going to require urgent and immediate action. He also said that the scenes from Italy in February 2020 really rattled him. He said he remembered seeing a note somewhere that the fatality rate there was 8% and thinking that it was appalling. He said, I didn't think the number could be right. I look at all this stuff with horror now and should have collectively twigged much sooner. He was also asked about taking a half-term holiday, it was dubbed by the media, in February 2020. He said that he didn't take a long holiday and he actually returned to Downing Street 3 times during the half-term break. He also had conversations with President Xi, Chinese president, to offer condolences and to compare notes, and he also spoke to President Trump as well. He said a lot was going on and the tempo really started to change and mount back at the end of February 2020.
Very interesting, Pip. And behind you, it appears as though there's a rather large crowd there. It's hard to differentiate between journalists and reporters, and potentially bereaved families are there. Are there also political protesters?
Yeah, I don't know whether we can actually give you an idea of how big this this hearing is today. Of course, we know it's been going on for many weeks. It's going to go on for several years still. But today, because it is the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson giving evidence, it is quite extraordinary. So immediately around me, you have the media. But if Paul, my cameraman, can just pan off to the right here, over my shoulder, you can see this truck that arrived early this morning. And then there are lots of bereaved families who have come out of the inquiry giving their reaction to what they have heard so far. They said to me that they wanted accountability. They did not want weak apologies. And I've been sitting in a media room on the first floor, and you could hear all morning, because there's been people standing outside holding banners. There's also been anti-vax campaigners here as well. There's been lots of motorists tooting away throughout the course of Boris Johnson's evidence. But it has now broken for lunch. This inquiry is due to reconvene at about 20 to 2 this afternoon. Boris Johnson will continue giving evidence into tomorrow as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Pip Tomson there outside the COVID inquiry in London, GB News presenter. Very interesting to see how large the crowds are there, many people gathering, and that was at lunch, so presumably some people will have disappeared off for the moment.
Absolutely. But it has been really interesting, this COVID inquiry, believe it or not. And one moment this morning took my eye. There was a dramatic point of contention this morning. Yes, dramatic. The inquiry lawyer, Hugo Keith KC, said that the UK had one of the highest rates of excess deaths in Europe. Yes, that's the direct quote. Shall we explore the data in reality?
Yes, so here, compiled by the excellent Oxford University publication Our World in Data, is the actual list.
Yes, the actual list shows the UK is not even near the top quartile of European countries for excess deaths over 2020 and 2021. It's hard to read, but we're in the lower half.
Indeed, the inquiry lawyer himself backtracked, instead confirming his comparison was actually about Western European countries.
I noticed that in your opening preamble a few months ago, you produced a slide saying that the UK was, I think, second only to Italy for excess deaths.
Correct.
That's not, to the best of my knowledge, the case. And I think that all I would say is that many other countries suffered terrible losses from COVID.
The evidence before Milady is that the United Kingdom had one of the highest rates of excess death in Europe. Almost all other Western European countries had a lower level of excess death.
I've seen.
Italy was tragically in a worse position than the United Kingdom.
Well, I don't wish to contradict you, Mr. Keith, but the evidence, the ONS data I saw put us, I think, about 16th or 19th in a table of 33.
In Western Europe, we were one of the worst off, if not the second worst off.
See what he did there? He changed his parameters from Europe to Western Europe. Perhaps next he'll change it even smaller. Are we the worst in the British Isles? But what's the truth? Here's the scrambled mess of excess death tolls across European countries. Now, it's impossible to see Britain amongst all of these lines because it's buried in the middle.
Yeah, there we are, in the middle of the pack. But Mr. Keith KC quickly insisted he was instead talking about only Western Europe.
Which is here on this graph. Now, it's probably quite easier to see where we are. We are, if we look at the next slide, right there in around the middle of the pack of Western Europe, not the highest.
So the only way you make the UK look as if it's anywhere near the top of the range is if you include the Scandinavian countries. Yes, including Sweden.
How very interesting. I'm not sure the COVID inquiry lawyer would want to make that comparison. Again, the UK not even the top country, not the second top, not the third top in that group of Western European countries. But it's interesting.
It does beg the question where Hugo Keith KC is getting his information from. Shall we speak to barrister and writer Stephen Barrett? Stephen, thank you very much for joining us on Good Afternoon Britain. Did you just saw those graphs that we showed to explain firstly what Hugo Keith claimed was true, that the UK had some of the highest excess deaths. What exactly was his claim again?
His claim was that amongst the highest in Europe. He then backtracked and said amongst the highest in Western Europe. But I'm not sure that's even an uncontested statement. Stephen Barrett, should the inquiry lawyer be proffering his own evidence like this?
No. And I wasn't intending to watch any of this inquiry. I stumbled on it quite by accident just because I was sat here doing something else that wasn't taking my full attention. And I found myself getting irritated with the KC, which is odd, because I don't have a political position on COVID or lockdowns or not locking down or anything like that. And I'm just simply neutral. So I asked myself, what is going on? And it's just how he is questioning is not neutral. It is not what you would expect of a scrupulously neutral inquiry or barrister. And with that event, he's absolutely caught out red-handed there. And he keeps doing a trick which is very irritating and also very wrong. Every time he says there is evidence before Milady, well, Milady hasn't reached any conclusions on the evidence because the inquiry hasn't finished, which means none of that has any extra validity. So why is he getting to pick and choose which of the bits of evidence that are before her are compelling? And the only reason I can think of is that the end point is predetermined. And it's looking incredibly like they have already decided that we didn't go into lockdown soon enough, that the government was confused, and they are simply pursuing that outcome, and questions are being asked to elicit answers. I think he got some out of Boris after a couple of hours, and no doubt those will be the bits that actually go into the report. I suspect we could write this report now. And given I am neutral on all of this, the only point I can make is that, well, it would save an awful lot of money if we wrote Baroness Hallett's report now, because she's not behaving like a judge. If I tried to ask questions like this, if I tried to ask two questions at once to a witness, you can't do that. If I ask a witness a question and then I shut them off, no, you can't do that. If a witness starts replying and then I add in additional words, which I saw him do with the word system failure, no, I'd get told off, you can't do that. She is not controlling this inquiry in the way that I would expect a judge to control this inquiry. You know, Mr. Keith appears to have a predetermined outcome and to be pursuing it rigorously, and she is doing nothing to prevent that. It does feel it could be written now.
I've seen a number of days of this inquiry now where they bring out extra lawyers, people representing, for example, the Bereaved Families for Justice group, a group that doesn't look like it's looking for answers in terms of what to do next time if there's a pandemic, but is looking for retribution, justice, as they would put it, to try and find a villain in this whole story, as long as that villain isn't the Chinese Communist Party. But if we're looking precisely at what is going on here, the Hugo Keith KC sort of started his piece by saying, look how bad Britain is. Look how awfully we have done, trying to find evidence to match his conclusion. Ignoring the fact that, according to the data that I've been looking at this morning from Our World in Data, a very respected institution, Italy, Portugal, Spain, many other Western European countries have higher accumulated death tolls. What does it tell you that the COVID inquiry lawyer is starting from this position, starting to say that Britain is oh so bad?
Yes, and I felt quite bad doing it. I tweeted that this was quasi-religious because I think it is quasi-religious. And then I felt slightly better because I got a WhatsApp from a fellow barrister who is no fan of Boris Johnson, who was absolutely outraged at the total lack of independence and objectivity that appears to be happening. He also appears to have decided that the COVID mortality rate is 2%, and that's absolutely true, fixed in stone. I mean, I don't think that is fixed in stone. In fact, I went to have a look at it. There's a rather large and exciting report you can read on the mortality rate. I mean, it's just not as clear as he thinks it is, but it does seem as though we're being fed, spoon-fed, predetermined outcomes, predetermined opinions, as gospel truth, as a new religious truth, and along with it, we've got this focus on feeling. And there is this massive focus on feelings. I mean, that feels totally alien to me. There are no feelings in a courtroom when I'm in it. You know, we deal with facts and we deal with law and we analyse what's going on. I don't understand why feelings have become the priority of this, what feels like predetermined inquiry.
Absolutely. Stephen, if you're right, and there is a predetermined outcome, or there are predetermined conclusions to this inquiry. What does that tell us about the state of our democracy and the state of these kind of processes that we're seeing? We're expecting this to cost millions in taxpayer money, for example. Would you say that the COVID inquiry isn't worth it, isn't fulfilling what it should be doing, is a waste of time and resources?
I think it's going too far if I take a position on the inquiry. I think my role generally is just to highlight what's going on and to speak truth. I seem to cause perfectly enough offence just by being honest. So I don't need to start giving my own opinions and causing extra offence. It is certainly an awful lot of money to spend on something which has every feeling of a predetermined outcome. It's an awful lot of money to be spent on feelings, and it is a large investment of our time and resources. How are we as a society? What are we doing? Because a democracy is very simple. Everybody is equal, and democratic votes matter and are respected, and they're taken seriously, and you don't belittle your political opponent. But there are other types of human society where there are elites, and they use emotion and show trials and bread and circuses to control the masses, and they indulge people, and that's a different type of society. Which one are we? Because I always thought we were the first kind. And this is really exposing. I mean, this just feels like the kangaroo court all over again. Certain people have a vendetta against Boris Johnson, and they're willing to use any means to pursue a vendetta against him. Now, other than probably the only point I can make about that is that that's quite dull, because we have done that one. And it may well be that the reason this inquiry is not getting as much attention is because we have done all that.
Obviously, they would say that they are performing, a public service. This is really to try to improve the way our government will approach the next pandemic. But we shall see what conclusions are drawn come the end of this very lengthy inquiry.
Yes, I hope they stop talking about gender balance and swearing. But there we are.